In the summer of 1947, something crashed in the desert outside Roswell, New Mexico. The events that followed have proven to be some of the most controversial in modern American history. Within hours, people around the US were speaking about alien bodies, a bizarre-looking craft, and a vast government cover-up. But what if the secret the government was protecting had nothing to do with little green men, and everything to do with another terrible reality? At first glance, these men might appear to be hobbyists of some sort, but a closer look reveals some glaring inconsistencies. The clothing, the official demeanor, and the presence of military personnel all point in one direction. This is Project Mogul. Most Americans have never heard about it, but without this operation, Roswell and the thousands of theories surrounding it could never have happened. Project Mogul was, on paper, almost disappointingly simple. A series of high-altitude balloons would be equipped with microphones, radio transmitters, and other equipment. The goal? To detect the distant sound waves created by Soviet atomic tests. In 1947, the Cold War, as it became known, was just getting started. This meant that what would evolve into global paranoia and daily bomb drills was, at this point, nothing more than an unsettling feeling washing over the US population. Throughout Project Mogul's timeline, the military tried a number of designs and materials, some of which looked very not of this earth. Early versions used clusters of rubber meteorological balloons, whereas later versions used polyethylene, which was larger, more durable, and maintained altitude more reliably. Often, aluminum reflectors and other equipment would be attached to the balloons, which would cause strange lights and glares across the American Southwest. Sightings of unidentified objects skyrocketed. Then, Roswell.
The Air Force tried to explain everything and had video to back it up. People who saw these saucer-like objects, it said, were actually looking at NASA space probes tested in New Mexico in the 1960s and 70s. These silvery devices, it said, were actually radar reflectors from a secret project in 1947. And these were not aliens, but dummies used in high-altitude ejection tests in the 50s. But the answers just triggered more questions, since the new pictures were mainly from the 50s and 60s, while the Roswell flying saucer reports occurred earlier in 1947.
Well, I'm afraid that's a problem that we have with time compression.
In 1997, Colonel John Haynes explained that the object that crashed in Roswell was a Project Mogul balloon that had been carrying experimental space probes.
But even if observers were mistaken about dates, said Colonel Haynes, it was understandable that they got the wrong idea about what they saw.
They saw body bags come out because the dummies were put into body bags to protect them. And when you put all that stuff together and spin it, you find that it fits perfectly with many of the occurrences in Roswell during that era.
But the questions, some serious, some not so serious, kept coming.
Were there any other Air Force experiments that you know of involving craft that looked like flying saucers?
An explanation, an admission. To some, it felt more like a cover-up. After all, many were quick to point out that 1947 was quite early for the military to be preparing for manned space flights. The National Aeronautics and Space Act, which created NASA, wasn't even signed until 1958. In this case, perhaps there is more to uncover.
Do you believe in UFOs?
Personally, no, sir.
Learning that Operation Mogul involved balloons does not diminish the sense of dread surrounding the program, especially not if you remember what it was intended to detect and prevent. While the Soviets perfected their atomic capabilities, the United States was doing everything it could to counter them. But doing so properly meant understanding the true effects of weapons that, at any moment, might destroy the world. Between 1951 and 1957, at the Nevada Proving Grounds, the U.S. military conducted a series of exercises under the code name Desert Rock. The goal was not only to test the weapons, but to explore the nuclear battlefield as a whole. Damage effects studies, psychological assessments, and direct exposure drills.
The Army is the land force, charged with the mission of seizing and retaining this control. The techniques, the tools, sometimes the tactics of warfare change. But this fact remains as true today as it ever was. Yes, even today, in the age of the atom, that fact remains.
Desert Rock took place alongside a cryptically named atmospheric nuclear test. Buster Jangle, Tumbler Snapper, Upshot Knothole, Teapot, Plumb Bomb. Unclassified documents reveal a tendency to use strange, playful names for what was essentially rehearsal for the end of the world. Thousands of Department of Defense participants were involved across the exercises, sometimes more than 20,000 in a single series. In many cases, troops were not just observers. Instead, they were forced to perform maneuvers in terrain that had just been altered by an atomic blast.
The land may be scarred and seared by weapons which stun the power of reason, but so long as it remains vital to victory, it is the task of the soldier to secure it and hold it. The battlefield of the future, if it exists, may well be an atomic battlefield. That brutal fact has forced upon the Army the absolute necessity of testing both men and tactical concepts under atomic conditions.
There's something deeply unsettling about what Desert Rock suggests. The idea that the military would turn nuclear detonation, the most destructive force ever conceived, into a line item on a training manual. Even worse was the fact that the Army so gleefully sent personnel into radioactive landscapes. Official briefings often assured soldiers that radiation risks were minimal. Most were not issued any form of protective gear. But it's unlikely the DoD was unaware that there would be residual radiation in the area, not to mention the fallout from dust and contaminated soil.
They have learned from authoritative sources the bomb's power and capabilities, the effects at various distances of heat, blast, and radiation in an atomic explosion. The greatest part of the energy, about 50%, is released in the form of blast. More than 30% is heat, and about 15% is nuclear radiation. They have learned what exposure can do to an unprotected individual. But along with this, they learn also how various kinds of shelter, including the soldier's foxhole, can give protection. This kind of information, based on fact rather than uninformed hearsay, goes a long way toward dispelling unreasoning fear.
Decades later, some veterans reported cancer and other illnesses they believed were linked to their participation in Desert Rock operations. As terrifying as that thought is, others agree that the attempt at normalizing men fighting alongside atomic weapons is even more disturbing.
Not the least significant of Desert Rock's missions has been the continuing war waged here against fear, fear of the unknown, in the minds of soldiers who might be called upon to fight on an atomic battlefield if an aggressor so determined. Ground troops have participated in most of the tests that have been conducted.
By the late 1960s, the Cold War had grown from a simmer to a boil. Korea had nearly drawn the Soviets and Americans into a direct conflict, just as Vietnam was doing currently. Both sides were desperate to know what the other was planning.
An ideal way to develop combat skill against an enemy aircraft would be to fly the enemy aircraft yourself before you had to fight it. Of course, that's an impossible ideal. Or is it? Most U.S. pilots flying combat over North Vietnam will never see a MiG-21 on the ground at close range, much less get a chance to fly it.
In 1966, an Iraqi Air Force pilot named Captain Munir Redfa defected mid-flight, delivering his Soviet-made MiG-21 to Israel. At the time, the aircraft was one of the most advanced in the Soviet arsenal. It was also being used by the Vietnamese. Understandably, the United States couldn't wait to get its hands on it. The subsequent operation, designated Have Donut, put American aviators in the pilot seat of their primary adversary.
Tactical Air Command and Navy fighter and attack pilots recently completed a thorough evaluation of the MiG-21 weapon system, analyzing it in an operational environment with all United States combat aircraft. The purpose of this tactical evaluation was to identify deficiencies and limitations which could be exploited to defeat the MiG-21. Air combat maneuvering situations which simulated the Southeast Asian operating environment were set up, and tactical maneuvers were flown in order to validate their effectiveness against the MiG-21. The lessons learned could save you and get your name on the list of MiG killers.
The aircraft was immediately redesignated the YF-110 and shipped to Groom Lake Airfield. There, both Air Force and Navy pilots were given the chance to fly the MiG-21 in a slew of controlled scenarios. This gave them, and entire teams of American engineers, insight to factors such as climb rate, turn performance, acceleration, and, of course, weaknesses. Though the project was kept hush-hush by the Department of Defense, they later documented everything. Later, it was presented as the sort of newsreel format one might see before a hit movie. The goal wasn't a dramatic revelation, it was familiarity, because once you understand how the enemy's best weapon operates, it's only one small step to designing tactics to exploit its weaknesses.
Lieutenant Colonel Joe B. Jordan, Tactical Air Command, and Commander Thomas J. Cassidy, Navy Air Development Squadron 4.
The purpose of Project Have Donut was the tactical exploitation of the MiG-21 airplane. We compared the MiG-21 with all Air Force and Navy fighter and attack airplanes, flying over 100 sorties. The majority of the flights were tactical, however several flights were devoted to the performance and stability envelope of the airplane. Several flights were flown for electronic intelligence gathering. Colonel Jordan flew the MiG-21 against all U.S. Air Force tactical airplanes. I flew the MiG-21 against all Navy fighter and attack airplanes. During the program, we exchanged several flights in an effort to compare tactical data. Joe, would you point out some of the performance characteristics of the MiG-21?
This MiG-21F-13 Bay fighter is a rugged, small, highly maneuverable, extremely reliable Mach 2 aircraft. It's capable of high G and low speed flight. We flew it as low as 120 knots in a tactical maneuvering situation. The aircraft has an excellent zoom capability and max power and an impressive turn capability due to its high thrust-to-weight ratio and low wing loading. The airspeed bleed-off in a high G sustained turn is very rapid below 400 knots due to its delta wing planform.
For nearly half an hour, two ace pilots talk about the MiG-21 as if it's a new vacuum that their company has for sale. They discuss its advantages, disadvantages, and some of the ways the F-4 Phantom II, the United States' most advanced fighter of the day, can be used to outgun and outmaneuver communist pilots. Despite the presentation of the materials, the secrecy surrounding the Have Donut program was intense. In fact, the Navy's inability to properly distribute what it learned from Have Donut contributed to the creation of the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, what would become known as Top Gun.
Joe, I think we should break out the handbook on the fitter and be prepared to fly it.
Raj.
Hallelujah.
It's difficult to overstate the degree to which the constant threat of nuclear Armageddon changed daily life during the mid-20th century. While students across the country were learning how to duck and cover beneath their desks, the military was preparing for what might happen if an accident occurred on American soil.
An explosion rocks the little town of Port Gaston, Virginia. As residents stream out of their homes and businesses, they discover a Navy helicopter has crashed. Part of it has landed in the park. The pilot is dead. They wonder about the tremendous explosion. Could the helicopter have been carrying nuclear weapons?
This isn't a newsreel or a preview for a new movie. It's part of the new WAX 83, a government-sponsored Cold War exercise designated to simulate a real nuclear catastrophe.
It is extremely unlikely that a nuclear weapon would be involved in such an accident. However, if it should happen, the immediate and long-term problems for local, state, and federal agencies could be very complex. The Defense Nuclear Agency, or DNA, a joint military command, has been tasked by the Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Atomic Energy to sponsor exercises for the military and civilian accident response organizations which would be called upon to resolve these problems. The exercises are designed to improve the nation's capability to respond to an accident such as the one described and to develop national-level guidance for such a response.
People who were not adults during the prime era of the Cold War will find it nearly impossible to imagine being ushered into a room and made to watch a Department of Defense video about proper safety during a nuclear weapons accident. Throughout the video, the scenario is described with unsettling calm. A Navy helicopter crashes near a small town in Virginia. It's tragic enough as it is, until it's discovered that it's actually carrying nuclear weapons. It's terrifying, yet it's presented as if it were an episode of The A-Team, complete with exciting theme music and credits.
Because of safety features built into the nuclear weapons of the United States, there has never been an accident which resulted in a nuclear yield. Further, no nuclear weapon accident has resulted in the spread of radioactive contamination since an incident in Tule, Greenland in 1968.
After reassuring the audience that this sort of event is extremely unlikely, the video goes on to provide behind-the-scenes insight into just how this particular episode of Nuclear Hellfire was planned and filmed.
DNA, the United States Navy, the Department of Energy, or DOE, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that is FEMA, and the Commonwealth of Virginia planned New WAX 83 as a follow-on to the previous exercises. The objectives were to build upon previous experience and provide for continued upgrading of national response capabilities. Planning included increased participation by federal, state, and local organizations. Further, the U.S. Navy was the primary military response organization, following the Air Force in 1979's exercise and the Army in 1981. A naval ordnance facility and a nearby civilian community were staged at the DOE's Nevada test site for the exercise. The exercise staff created the town of Port Gaston and Jefferson County, with simulated facilities which would be affected by the simulated accident. The Catfish Cabin Cafe and Fish Market, Captain Nemo Memorial Park, a radio station and newspaper, a trailer park, the Jefferson County Building, hospital, industrial park, RV park, and a reservoir.
Even more disturbing than the happy-go-lucky music and excitement about the start of the incident was the degree of detail that the military put into the planning. Not only did they use real helicopter wreckage and real military personnel, but they also used real radioactive isotopes, which were distributed across the area to simulate explosive dispersal. Specifically, they used radium-223 and palladium-103. Both are hazardous outside of carefully controlled medical use, but the military simply chose them so that their monitoring equipment could respond as if plutonium were present. They dispersed poison across a fake town in order to make the simulation more real.
Shortly before D-Day, real contaminants were spread in a pattern which would realistically simulate explosive dispersal. The contaminants, radium-223 and palladium-103, cause monitoring equipment to react as it would to plutonium. The radioactivity of these isotopes will decay to background levels in a matter of months.
As well-planned and well-produced as New Wax 83 was, the point was not spectacle, but response. The Defense Nuclear Agency, the Navy, the Department of Energy, FEMA, the Commonwealth of Virginia, the EPA, the FDA, and the Red Cross, as well as federal, state, and local organizations, were all on hand to rehearse the scenario.
The scenario called for 2 Navy CH-46 Sea Knight helicopters, one a Marine escort and the other a transport carrying 3 nuclear weapons from the ordnance facility to another nearby naval station. A mechanical problem forced the escort to land. The transport attempted to turn around and return to the facility. Suddenly, a rotor broke off, slicing into the aircraft. As the helicopter broke apart, 2 of the weapons fell and hit the ground. One exploded and scattered radioactive debris. The front portion of the helicopter fell inside the base. The rear section fell into the park.
Everyone on hand was told to treat the incident as if it were actually happening. The use of smoke, flames, and sirens all served to enhance the atmosphere. All actors pretended to be injured by debris or radiation exposure.
People of Port Gaston ran toward the wreckage, anxious about families and friends. Firefighters and rescue personnel responded from Jefferson County and from the base. Inadvertently, the citizens and rescuers contaminated themselves and spread the radioactive contamination from the accident site. Local, state, and Navy medical personnel attended to the injured people.
Everything that followed played out much as it would in reality. Marines established a perimeter, while explosive ordnance disposal teams assessed the condition of the weapons. Elsewhere, radiological teams deployed air samplers and set up contamination control stations to monitor and decontaminate civilians and responders. There were even mock press conferences to simulate the duty of informing the public of the radiation leak. Perhaps the most dystopian footage from the event involves government officials determining which rights it might have the power to restrict, and how they might do so.
In this particular exercise, as would be true in any emergency, the major questions come in the area of constitutional rights, the power of the states, the power of the federal government, and the power of the locality to restrict individuals' rights, both a private citizen as well as members of the press. The state wasn't a party to the suit, but some citizens of Port Gaston did file suit against the federal government, alleging violations of their constitutional rights. In a similar fashion, in this type of emergency, we have 3 types of government. We have the federal government, the state government, and the local government. And there are many jurisdictional questions that arise, and who can best handle it, and who is legally empowered to handle the various problems which arise.
They even experimented with arresting looters.
A looter inside the NDA was handed over to Port Gaston police, who passed him on to the FBI, who passed him back to the police, who passed him back to the Marines, who turned him over to the Naval Investigative Service, who finally turned him over to the Navy Command Security Officer. The matter was complicated by the fact that he had been in a contaminated area. It is evident that detailed plans need to be developed concerning legal jurisdictions.
As farcical and borderline psychopathic as the entire operation might seem, New Wax 83 was a rousing success. Like most operations of its kind, it ended with detailed assessments, during which successes and challenges were carefully noted. Overall, the agencies involved agreed that the trial run improved national response capability. Still, it's impossible to avoid the fact that you're watching the apocalypse be broken down into a series of processes and committees. This is, after all, preparation for something that would leave many Americans dead. For many of the organizations involved, the systemization of tragedies had begun long ago.
Operation Hardtack 1958 encompassed a greater variety of military effects studies than any previous nuclear test series, necessitating the division of the Defense Atomic Support Agency's review of the effects results into 4 films. Part 1 covers basic effects, particularly of megaton devices, and effects on material and structures. Part 2 describes the effects results for the 3 high-altitude shots. Part 3 is devoted to the effects results for underwater tests. Part 4 reviews the effects of sub-kiloton detonations.
One of the scariest things about the history of atomic weaponry is that scientists were so focused on whether or not they could build one that they rushed through the process with that single goal in mind. It would take decades of study and some of the most dangerous experiments on the planet to figure out exactly what these weapons could do. So, in 1958, more than a decade after the devastation of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the US government began conducting a series of tests to determine how destructive atomic bombs really were. They called in Operation Hardtack. Operation Hardtack was not a single detonation, but an extended campaign. Between April and October of 1958, the United States conducted 35 nuclear tests across the Pacific Proving Grounds, primarily at Bikini and Eniwetok atolls. Some devices were detonated in the atmosphere, others underwater, and several were carried high above the Earth by rockets before being triggered. Each detonation had a specific objective: to determine what atomic weapons actually did in different environments.
Although only limited data resulted because the radiological situation prevented early recovery of the detectors, successful measurement of neutron flux and spectra were made for a number of ranges.
Across the atolls, carefully instrumented test environments were assembled. Concrete buildings were constructed to military specifications using different materials and configurations. When the detonations occurred, the footage focused less on the fireball and more on the objects placed in its way. Walls bowed under overpressure before giving way. Reinforced concrete fractured along predictable stress lines, steel beams twisted. Virtually no thought was given to who might be in those structures when the bombs went off elsewhere. It wasn't seen as destruction, it was just data. After each explosion, the data was recorded and the team moved on.
The introduction of powerful anti-submarine nuclear weapons into the Navy's arsenal posed some critical problems. What are the safe standoff distances for various types of vessels operating in the vicinity of subsurface nuclear weapon detonations? And what are the kill ranges for various types of ships? Some of the answers were on hand. Information gleaned from the 1946 shallow water Crossroads Baker shot.
The underwater test introduced a different visual logic. When a nuclear device detonates beneath the surface, the ocean does not burn. It erupts. This forms a massive dome of vaporized seawater and debris, which collapses in on itself, sending concentric waves racing outwards. Tests on ships had been done before, but once again, a fleet of decommissioned vessels was positioned at carefully measured distances from the blast point.
The manned submarine Bonita was submerged at periscope depth Further out were a number of active manned ships, including the submarine Sterlet. H hour for the Deepwater shot was 1330 on 16 May.
Again, the devastation wasn't the story. Instead, the focus was on the destruction and the potential impact on the natural world. Instead, it was all about shockwave velocity, hull breach thresholds, and the transmission of force through water versus air. Hardtack was about turning an endless capacity for suffering into usable data and replicable experiments. And it didn't stop at land and sea.
Today's increasing international emphasis on long-range ballistic missile activity raises to priority attention the mastering of high-altitude burst effects phenomenology. At stake are urgent problems, such as those associated with ICBM defense, as well as the upper air burst effects on radio communications and radar.
High-altitude testing was relatively new for atomic bombs. Before 1958, only 2 bombs had ever been detonated above 10,000 feet. In what will go down as perhaps some of the most reckless weapons testing in history, the US military fired 3 high-altitude shots of various strengths.
On hardtack, 3 high-altitude shots were fired to acquire data necessary to develop a national capability for high-altitude warfare. Yucca, a 1.7 kiloton device suspended from a balloon, and Teak and Orange, both 3.8 megaton devices carried by Redstone missiles. All were fired to obtain effects data for the fulfillment of 3 general objectives. First, to find out how extreme altitudes affect the partition of energy in a nuclear detonation, and what is the radial extent of the various phenomena. Second, to determine scaling laws for various effects as a function of altitude and yield. Third, to determine the effects of high-altitude bursts on the ionosphere and on the propagation of radio and radar signals.
While they lacked the same visual impact as the other detonations, the high-altitude tests were perhaps the most dangerous of all the hardtack experiments. Studies showed that they produced artificial radiation belts so powerful that they disrupted the Earth's magnetosphere. The resulting fallout of those in the lower test settled onto coral reefs, lagoon sediments, and surrounding ocean ecosystems, where they remained in soils and marine life for decades. Today, populations living around Bikini Atoll report highly elevated instances of thyroid disease, mostly linked to radioactive iodine. The VA, meanwhile, was eventually forced to acknowledge the effects of hardtack and desert rock on its own personnel. Though the video footage may be packaged into an easy-to-digest reel, complete with Hollywood-level narration, the unclassified footage you're seeing is no less an atrocity. The words chemical warfare are rarely attached to such boisterous music. However, in the 1940s, the best way to sell World War II was to present it in a way that masked all of its horrors. Masks being the operative word in this case.
There are few things more useless than a gas mask that leaks. Masks leak for two reasons. Either the mask isn't properly fitted to your face, or it has become defective through dampness or bad handling.
Presenting a documentary on the proper use of gas masks, the way you might issue a guide to dating or puberty, is odd in retrospect. However, it would have resonated with the average military recruit at the time, and while World War II was more commonly associated with gas attacks, it was still a very deadly reality in 1944. The Army needed their soldiers alive, not choking to death in the mud, and so they produced training films that eventually became tone poems for the entire era.
When you're issued your mask, you become personally responsible for its care. You should inspect your mask once a week. First, inspect the carrier. Examine the shoulder strap for cuts or broken buckles.
The presentation is calm and methodical. There's no urgency in the narrator's voice, no dramatic music underscoring the stakes. The assumption is simple. This is equipment, and equipment must be maintained. But, like so many classified military films of the era, it takes a dramatic turn when a squad of soldiers is filmed testing their masks in a real-world scenario.
There is only one final test for a mask. Will it give protection in the presence of real gas? The squad is sent into a gas chamber, and gas is released. If the masks fit correctly, there will be no bad effects. If you haven't checked your mask carefully enough, you'll find out now.
The most interesting aspect of this piece of footage is the way the threat is never visualized. The men watching this will be on the front lines in weeks, perhaps days, facing challenges that go far beyond anything shown in this video. Unclassified footage isn't remarkable for what it shows, but for what it reveals. Often, they show a world we hope no longer exists.